have a question from someone off-site, which says, can we make use of ORCID and web-based records to help aid transparency on expertise, possible conflicts of interest, etc.? Is that something that either you, Mark, or John would like to respond to?
Well, that's an answer, yes. I mean, I'm not sure how much we can elaborate on that, but I think that's clearly a yes answer, that the more we can do it, the more we can put experts in contact with people who want expertise or organizations that want expertise, whether they find it through ORCID or some other web-based record. Clearly, you want to put people who are willing to do it, and then we assume if people are willing to do it, that they have some sense of how they're going to communicate the information. So we hope that you self-select, that if you say you're willing to help, that you in fact are able to help.
Great, thank you. Now a question or two from the audience. Yes, we have our leader here, Marcia, is going to get a mic in just a moment, and we'll have an opportunity, I think, to do that. And meanwhile, if there are other questions, we'll take those too.
It's on. Marc, you mentioned that fear doesn't work well with the public, and I agree with that. I think that everyone was pleasantly surprised by the public's fascination with the Great American Eclipse. I wonder what other sorts of activities of that sort the scientific community could sort of find that could engage the fascination of the American public with the wonders and the predictability of science, to show that it really is something that can fascinate an entire nation. Because, you know, everyone turned out, people traveled hundreds to 1,000 miles to watch something that was over in a matter of minutes.
I think this is a wonderful example, and another one we saw just in the last year was the fascination of the public with the results from LIGO on merging black holes and neutron stars. There was enormous excitement. I remember driving to the airport in New York and seeing a billboard that said, "The universe is expanding, but your closet space is not." And so you know, there are scientific discoveries that excite the public. We have to learn from how the astronomy community has done this so well to extend it to other areas, right? Absolutely.
I think it also points to the importance of informal learning. One of the other endeavors that is going on was with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and Kathleen Hall Jameson and Skip Lupi has recently participated in a webinar for the Media Impact Funders, and we asked them what are they learning over this 3-year project, and I think Kathleen underscored the importance of the opportunities that we have to engage the public with informal learning such as an eclipse or other activities too. So thank you for bringing that up and underscoring that too. Is there another question from the audience? I'll lean forward to see if, yes, we have one right here. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Amanda Stanley from Compass. I was really interested in what you had to say, a little nugget about the role of philanthropy in experimenting with different ways of communicating science and reaching people. And can you talk a little bit about the role of philanthropy in funding those experiments as well as bringing them to scale?
Go ahead, John.
Well, I think, and we'll generalize it past science communication, I think that's probably the most important role that philanthropy can serve, is trying things that are different, providing models that in turn can be translated into a larger world that ultimately gets picked up potentially by the government. We should be more nimble. We should have less bureaucracy. We should have fewer barriers to doing such things, and we should be trying some ways of running models running pilot programs that in turn can either fail or succeed. One of my hopes is that philanthropies are also comfortable with failure. Tried some programs, they don't work, they don't catch, they're not effective. That's great. That's a success. It's very difficult for program officers to embrace that as a success, but in fact it is. And so that's one of the things we like to do, and I know many of the other philanthropies do, and I'm sure Marc could comment even more on that with some of these young people that he's dealing with.
So I think, I would say more generally, the role of philanthropy in areas where the federal government also should take a role. The role of philanthropy is special because the federal government is very conservative. At one event we had Cory Bargman, who's now president of the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, said that the federal government is extremely good at protecting the taxpayers' money when it funds research, and that means it's very conservative. Philanthropists can be much more risk-taking, as John said, and can take a longer time scale view because they don't have to have results on a 3-year time scale for the next proposal. So I think this is really important for all science, including the science of communication, that philanthropy can do these things, and they can be nimble and act quickly. And I think, as Elizabeth said, we had a presentation by Science Counts at one of our members' meetings, and I think within weeks, a number of the attending organizations had offered to support Science Counts, so they could just make those decisions on a very short time scale.
I think one of the other things that we're seeing that we need forums, more opportunities for funders to get together, for philanthropists to get together to share what they're doing, to share best practices of how they might do things, to collaborate on things, and also to talk about evaluation. We haven't really talked about, as we experiment, there are perhaps different ways to be thinking about it, but sometimes these are some very complex things that we're trying to assess and think about. And so just briefly, John, to speak a little bit about evaluation, because we spoke about that earlier.
Sure, and I think evaluation is probably the toughest nut in many ways to crack, because the simple measures of evaluation rarely reflect the actual success of what you've done. So in communication, it might be the number of hits, or it might be the number of citations. In many of our things, it's reduced to the things that we can measure. We can measure the number of publications, we can measure number of grants, we can maybe measure the number of speeches, but it's extraordinarily difficult to see what impact something is, how it's been long range. And I know in Europe they devote an enormous amount of time tracking each one of their awardees and looking at the whole field and trying to make an evaluation of whether or not it was not only quantitatively successful, but qualitatively successful. So I will assure you that we and almost all foundations spend a lot of time trying to figure out what we do, whether it has any impact at all, and we still find ourselves coming back usually to the quantitative. The qualitative is generally reduced, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but to a storytelling mode. In other words, X or Y happened, but it's very difficult to evaluate past the quantitative and then the occasional qualitative.
So it's an area that we continue to need to discuss and talk about different ways, maybe even with developmental evaluation. I know one of our questions remotely also is how we can provide incentives for practitioners to communicate based on the evidence of what's effective. And there are some efforts underway too to be addressing that, but clearly a lot more is needed in this area too. I'm going to close with one final question for each of you, and that is if you had a significant amount of funding, where would you place it if you wanted to advance the field of science communication?
Well, I think I would follow the recommendations of the consensus report and put more money into the science of science communication. Do more research, do more experiments.
And I would pick up on that, but I would also pick up on the question that came earlier. Not only do more research on what's effective, but run some actual experiments. where scientists try some methodological changes, try something, and then have an evaluation, as we had, as to whether or not it's effective. So far too rarely do we cite science, far too rarely do we ever do any science. And so I think it's great that we as foundations are in the position to try some of those experiments. So if you give us a good experiment, that would be something to me that would make sense to fund.
Very good. And with appreciation to all the philanthropists in the audience and who are supporting this effort, we thank you, and especially to John and to Marc for your time this morning. Thank you very much.
Great job. Thanks a lot.